Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Abrahamic relations. My main research interest has been on Muslim-Jewish relations, but of course you can't really talk about Muslim-Jewish relations without talking about Christianity as well. So, first sort of question that I sort of think to myself regularly, what makes a Muslim, for example, different to a Jew? What are the boundaries really that exist amongst these peoples of different faiths? But it's really a sort of shared Abrahamic thrust as well. Is it creed? Is it a set of beliefs, for example? When did this creed develop? When did Christians start to exist as a separate community, for example? And these types of questions really sort of informed my research. What we have from sort of a couple of hundred years ago are scholars like Geiger. And Abraham Geiger, when he sort of presented Islam, he presented it as a sort of reified faith, that once the Prophet Muhammad comes on the scene, what did he take from Judaism? And Judaism was a reified religion that hadn't really changed according to his sort of understanding. And this sort of block vision of this is what Islam is, this is what Christianity is, this is what Judaism is, and they're not changing or influencing each other, has been sort of displaced recently by scholars like Montgomery, who talk about cross-pollination, about how these faiths interact with one another and shape each other. And that led me also to questioning, did figures like Moses, Jesus, Mohammed, these figures and also patriarchs and saints and these types of figures, did they think they were part of any sort of new religion? Really, are they vying for the same thing? Is it the inheritance of an Abrahamic monotheism that they're all vying for? So these are all sort of questions that I was asking myself when I started. And then I thought, okay, I come from a Muslim background, so I thought, I'm sort of well placed to look at what Muslims think about the other, and I was really interested in thinking about what Muslims think about Jews. There's not that much scholarship on this, so I thought, okay, let's go right back to the beginning. And this is what my MPhil was on. It was on the Constitution of Medina, and Medina is the city in which the Prophet Muhammad himself interacts with a very large Jewish community. And in Medina, we have the construction of a very interesting document called the Constitution of Medina, which declares, amongst other things, complete and full enfranchisement of Jews. Indeed, the Jews are a community with the believers. And this word, ummah, is a really interesting word in Arabic. It really means that this is a group that considers one another on the same divine path of salvation. However, later in the Medinan period, in the Prophet Muhammad's life, there is a breakdown in relations between Muslims and Jews, and this differentiation is highlighted as Islam does become reified, as it becomes a sort of a religion in and of itself. So, what are reified religions? Communities are, of course, being shaped consistently and defining themselves against one another. It's a very us versus them type of mentality. But I've identified that there are really three sort of main things that are used, and that is creed, so what one believes in. It's also law. So of course we have Islamic law called Sharia, Jewish law called Halakha, for example. They can be quite they can create sort of laws that keep the community quite insular at times. And there's of course salvation theology, right? What God is going to do with us, essentially. And these are all used in order to create differentiation and barriers, really, between these emerging faiths. So how did Muslims achieve this differentiation? This is what my PhD centered on. And I'm hopefully near the end, so I'll be requesting prayers from you guys at the end to help me with submission. But it's really through the construction of what I've termed anti-exemplary models, and these are not necessarily based on actual events at all, but this is really about the depiction of the other within religious texts. And so many anti-exemplary groups in Islamic thought exist. From polytheists in Arabia who were worshipping multiple deities to Jews and Christians, for example, who did not fully acquiesce to acknowledging Muhammad, for example, or following Islam. And so Jews in particular are very important within early Islamic literature because they were engaged with on such a regular basis in Medina. And so I argue that these anti-exemplary models are for didactic reasons. They are pedagogic archetypes in which scholars and exegetes, for example, can explain negative behavior to Muslims through the use of literary anti-exemplars. It's a completely literary tool, not necessarily based in any sort of historical reality. So Jews and Christians are both presented as anti-exemplars, but rather differently. My research focused on Jews, but I'll bring Christians in a little bit as well, because I think it's quite an interesting differentiation. So let's talk about Christians first. So they're what I call within Islamic literature as theological anti-exemplars. In sort of layman's terms, what not to believe. And so concepts like the triune God, for example, the Quran is rather clear. Do not say that God is one of three, rather he is one. They say God has a son, glory unto him, he is free from what they claim. These types of verses which are commented upon by scholars over the centuries to solidify really this differentiation in the concept of God. Then we have Jews. Does anyone want to have a guess as to what that might be? It's not theological anti-exemplars, it's slightly different. Any? Nope? Okay. What we have is behavioral anti-exemplars. What not to do, basically. And so Jews within Islamic literature are then associated to certain behavioral traits. These are themes like disbelief, arrogance, concealing the truth, hard-heartedness, corruption in the land, altering scripture, misunderstanding laws, etc., etc. It's almost as if, with Christians, the concept of God was such a big elephant in the room that it couldn't go beyond that. Whereas when it came to Jews, the concept of God was largely similar. So first of all, Christians were less common in Medina. Jews, of course, share the same conception of God as in Islam. It's a Unitarian faith. And the Quran actually praises Christian behavior and praises Jewish theology. This is where it gets interesting. I meant to say it's always interesting. The Quran praises Christian behavior by saying, for example, you will find those closest to the believers, those who say we are Christians. That is because amongst them are priests and monks, and because they are not arrogant. Again, a behavioral trait at the end. And the Quran praises Jewish Unitarian theology. So within the Quran, we have a very famous verse, say he is God, the one, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. And that word, ahad, is the very same word that's used in the Shema Israel, which is a very famous part of the Bible that's recited by Jews daily, that it's Adonai Echad, it's one God. It's the very same word that's used in both the Hebrew Bible and in the Quran. So in general, these attitudes over the centuries were sort of internalized into what some have termed the Muslim imaginary. These criticisms didn't just come out of nowhere. They adapted pre-existing Christian anti-Jewish polemic, for example. A lot of what the church fathers and Gnostic thinkers had to say about Jews, including Justin Martyr, Origen, and others. And these same sort of Christian criticisms that we get in the first few centuries, Veris Israel, that the early Christians are the true Israel because they're embodying a following of the spirit of the law rather than a sort of a carnal interpretation of the law. And we have phrases from early church fathers that though they are lowly, they never practice idolatry. Again, their conception of God is praised, which is quite interesting. So these criticisms from within Islam are not also, they're also drawing on criticisms that already exist. And so in that way, really, these criticisms are kind of done from within. These are all seen as internal heresies. Islam will view Christianity and Judaism as part of a shared faith, but they just got it wrong, and the same pretty much all around. So, considering that it's CSAR, applying research to real life, there is a man called Abdullah bin Bayya, who's this individual here, who is trying to reconceptualize the status of non-Muslims in Muslim societies. So he is seeking to, for example, recreate the rights enshrined in the Constitution of Medina, by the Prophet Mohammed enshrining those rights for the Jews through a document called the Marrakesh Declaration. As was said in the introduction, I work with the Good Faith Partnership. Sheikh bin Bayya spearheads the Forum for Peace, who we work with very closely. And that's given me an ability to see the sort of real-life implications of my research in some ways. So I've conducted community roundtables, for example, where I go to Muslim communities in the UK and we sort of have academic discussions as well about the Marrakesh Declaration, its implications, we found that quite interesting sort of results from that. A lot of the Muslims were not aware of the rights that were enshrined to minorities in early Islam, and it's a really good sort of touching base with these communities. It's very important, especially considering what's going on now in the Middle East. And I also work with the Abrahamic family house in Abu Dhabi, which some of you may have seen. It's sort of a big church, synagogue, and mosque, and they try and get Muslims, Jews, and Christians to engage positively. And the AI Commission. It's the AI Faith and Civil Society Commission, which seeks to bring different perspectives to AI that perhaps we don't necessarily have. And it's a response to the Rome Call, in which the Pope sought to bring an ethical sort of view to AI in the world, essentially. So I'm happy to also for people to reach out as well. That's my email there. And that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. That was fascinating. We'll have questions now. Are there questions from the audience? Yep. Whoosh, straight in. Come to the microphone.
Can you use the concept of anti-exemplars, as it were, to explain the fragmentation within one faith? I'm thinking of the fragmentation of the Christian faith between Catholics and Protestants, and then Protestants with Methodists and so on, and seemingly endless fragmentation.
Absolutely. So we definitely see that within faiths, with the development of orthodoxies, essentially. And as you can imagine, it just gets narrower and narrower until there are only a few scholars at the top who believe in a certain set of interpretations of that belief. And then you'll have a parallel mountain to that, in which there'll be another set of, and so each religion then it gets more and more fragmented. But what's interesting also is that I found a lot of the criticisms that are used internally. So within Islam, for example, it's the Sunni and Shia, which is very similar to the Catholic and Protestant divide. The criticisms that Muslim scholars would level, that Sunni scholars would level against Shias, for example, are often taken from what they would level against others, like Christians or Jews, for example. And they say, oh, well, these are the internal Christians, or these are the internal Jews, and we have to make sure that we also don't follow them. And so, that's absolutely used, within religions as well.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I noted that there's a famous teaching of Jesus that says, you have been taught an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you, love your enemies. And in the present version of Islam seems to have reverted to that kind of exclusivist, non-tolerant. But during the golden age of Islam, it was completely different, that particularly Jews lived very happily alongside Muslims in the Middle East, and also in Al-Andalus and other places. I wonder whether you can give any insight to the process by which Islam changed from its golden age, wide open, embracing science or whatever, to its modern, less tolerant form.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think it's partly due to political disturbances. For example, people often view the golden age of Islam as, like you say, the sort of the Abbasid era, which was, the house of wisdom, and philosophers used to gather, and they had royal patronage and things like that. But in a way, it sort of continued into the Ottoman Empire as well. And people often overlook that. So it was really going on until the 1920s, essentially. And the way that non-Muslim societies lived in the Ottoman Empire, for example, was the millet system, which, if we compare it to the way that we have citizenship, for example, today in modern nation states, is quite different. For example, someone can become a British citizen for having lived X number of years in the UK, receiving the same number of rights, being tested in the same court of law as anybody else. Whereas in the Islamic world, the way that it would work is that the head of state, or the sultan, or whoever it was, who would be in charge of only Muslim affairs. And that Christians and Jews that lived within those societies would have their own courts, their own jurisdictions. It's almost as if the Muslim state didn't want to get involved at all in their communities. And so that's quite a different way of looking at it. It's only when that basically that couldn't be internally resolved that it would then go to a Muslim leader who would arbitrate, essentially. And so, that structure continued until the 20s, essentially. And then what we have after that is we have, the Muslim empire essentially crumbles, and there are a lot of different views, a lot of different worldviews, a lot of different views on things like citizenship, constitutions, and things like that emerge within the Muslim world that are mainly from Western models. And then, in my opinion, it was hard for Muslims to really accept those, because they maybe viewed that came from without the Islamic tradition, came from beyond the Islamic tradition. Where that's why I think projects like what Sheikh bin Bayyah is doing is quite important, because it demonstrates that we can go back to, for example, giving non-Muslims rights, for example, in Muslim communities. That is, literally, that really does come from the origins of Islam. And this, so in 2016, it was the height of, I think it was the height of ISIS and things like that as well. And so these scholars got together and they thought, okay, this is a real problem that's in Muslim societies, and we need to resolve this from within the Islamic tradition. And so that's why it was done. But like you say, I think a lot of political instability probably led to a lot of different political views, really, within the Islamic world, and that was never really resolved, ever, I'd say. Yeah.
One last question.
Slightly more practical. Have you found in your community roundtables that attitudes have changed since last October?
Yes, definitely. So I work a lot in interfaith, and it's become very difficult. It's a very difficult space. Partially, the religious leaders are sort of, it's not that they don't necessarily want to engage. It's pressures within their communities as well. That if you're viewed to being, to engaging in this sort of thing in this moment, then you could be seen as taking sides or not taking the right side and things like that. So yes, definitely, I've noticed, especially in the Muslim community and the Jewish community in the UK, it's been very, very difficult. However, what I will say on the flip side, which is quite surprising, and I didn't think that this would be the case, but I'm sort of in this world a little bit. Is that a lot of the very top voices within the UK and sort of elsewhere realize that interfaith and faith discussions are very, very important at this moment. And that the work that we're doing, I started this sort of before, essentially, but I think there's also a pressure to make sure that this keeps going, that faith communities are engaging with one another regularly and positively because of what's happening as well in Israel-Palestine.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I think we should stop there. And I wish you the best of luck in changing hearts and minds.
Thank you very much.